the science is clear that this is an addictive, not a substance, but an addictive device. And it's being tweaked, right, by the engineers for profit to make it as addictive as possible.
Brett McCracken is an author and senior editor at the Gospel Coalition. He's the co-editor of a new book called Scrolling Ourselves to Death, Reclaiming Life in a Digital Age. And he's the author of several other books, including The Wisdom Pyramid, Feeding Your Soul in a Post-Truth World. You say in your book that the death march of our scrolling society is not just a metaphor. In many ways, the smartphone is literally killing us. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple levels of like the death that we're talking about when we talk about scrolling ourselves to death. I mean, there are physical deaths that happen from like distracted driving. People are like scrolling Instagram while they're driving, and that's like a growing cause of roadway fatalities. So, but I think more common is the mental health kind of death that we're experiencing in our culture, where anxiety, depression, loneliness, all of these things are on the rise, and this is well documented. It's correlating with the introduction of the smartphone, about 15 years ago. But what we're really concerned about is the spiritual death component. That's why we put this book together, to look at how is the smartphone creating spiritual death and spiritual sickness for Christians.
And how is it? How is it creating spiritual death?
Well, I think spiritual health, so much of it depends on attention, giving our attention to God, having time to be with Him, right? Any relationship will live or die based on how much time you have or you don't have with your spouse or with your kids. The same is true with God, right? If we don't have time to be with God, we will shrivel on the vine. We won't have spiritual life. And what is the phone doing? It's taking that time away. We're choosing to scroll on our devices rather than have quiet time with
What if
the Lord.
I'm scrolling on my device through a C.S. Lewis quote, through a Bible verse, through a devotional? Is that the same thing as spending time in the Bible?
I think sometimes there can be good things. Sometimes there can be nourishing things that you come across on your phone. But I think if what you're doing is kind of scrolling from that C.S. Lewis quote to the next thing, and it's just this constant cycle of consumption, then it's still, the net cumulative effect is not good for you, because it's making you more of an addict to your device, and you're not spending time in quiet time with the Lord, praying to Him, worshiping, just being still and knowing that He is God.
I think you're absolutely right. You're hitting the bullseye, that real relationship with real persons, including the persons of the Trinity, cannot be replaced by a digital representation or somebody else giving us devotional thoughts about that person. You also draw insights for your book, Scrolling Ourselves to Death, from another book in 1985 called Amusing Ourselves to Death, written by Neil Postman. Who was Postman, and what was his book all about?
So Postman was an intellectual at New York University, Jewish, not a Christian, but he was a critic of media and technology, and was writing very intelligently, very prophetically, I think, 40 years ago, about the way technologies at the time, in the 80s, it was mostly television, he was talking about how they just change things. Every technology changes things in culture. Sometimes it can be good changes, a lot of times it's bad changes, but every technology changes things. And that book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, was kind of his critique of how technology was changing the way we think, changing the way we talk. And in his case, it was mostly negative. So we just took inspiration from that book on the 40th anniversary of it, 2025. It's 40 years after Amusing Ourselves to Death came out. And we thought, what if we took Postman's kind of prophetic, critical way of looking at the technologies of his day and did it for the digital age, but with a specific focus on Christianity and church, and how all of these technologies are changing the way we think about God and faith and worship and discipleship.
That's fascinating. So what are some of the insights that you took from Postman's book 40 years ago and brought forward to today for the family of faith?
A big thing that Postman talks about in his book is just the way that television at the time was changing the way people thought about the importance of information. He was saying on TV, you get like a news broadcast will have like a story of great significance, like some sort of like important political headline, next to like a little vignette about a cute missing puppy, right? And then a weather report and sports report. And that's just TV. It's just, and this, and this, and this. And Postman was saying the effect of that on our brains and our souls is kind of putting everything on a level playing field.
Yeah.
And we're losing a sense of what is truly important, what's trivial.
Yeah.
Everything becomes
Losing
trivial.
that hierarchy
Yes.
of significance that, hey, we're talking about
Yeah.
a world war, or
Right.
we're talking about a pandemic,
Yeah.
or about the education of our children and the future of our nation, right next to,
Yeah.
There's a pervert who has parties for children.
Yeah.
And
it's all flattened. And if that was true 40 years ago, how much more true is it today in the era of the feed, right? We all encounter the world through these feeds. And one thing that's true of all social media feeds is it's just one thing after another that are totally disconnected. You know, it's like a cat video next to a headline about genocide, next to a silly dance video on TikTok, next to a Bible verse. You know, it's just this crazy amalgam of anything and everything. And there's science that's showing that our brains, literally our brains are struggling to catch up with that overstimulation. So we're losing kind of brain cognitive capacity because of that. But I think our souls are also kind of becoming numb a little bit because when you encounter like important things next to trivial things, next to important things, over time, you just kind of lose perspective.
It all just sort of blurs together.
It blurs together.
It's like you put it all in a blender, you mix it together, all of a sudden it's just all sort of like...
And that's your TikTok feed or your X feed.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it is interesting from a marketing perspective or a producing perspective, if your goal is simply to get people to never stop looking at your phone, well, then give them the variety.
Which is the goal.
Them back and forth to all these different interesting things.
Yeah.
And
that's why it is what it is. That we have to understand.
That is the goal.
I mean, that's why the Social Dilemma documentary is helpful, because it kind of peels back the curtain and reminds us these are businesses.
That's right.
And they have a vested interest in keeping our attention.
So addiction is the goal.
And so addiction is the goal. And to do that, novelty is a key part of that.
Yep.
Variety, but also increasingly algorithmic tailoring of content specifically to you as the consumer. And AI, that's what I'm scared about with AI is if they're already sophisticated at knowing exactly what you, Kirk, are going to be inclined to click on when you open your phone, how much more is that going to be the case with AI that learns us in a very sophisticated way? So it's going to only become harder to resist the clicking on what is presented to us on our phones.
Yep. So what are some of the things that Christians can do on a practical level to guard themselves and to be able to push back and actively do something to get healthier in this area?
Yeah. I think there's real practical things that I recommend. Trying to carve out a little bit of time every day to not have your phone with you. So maybe start with like 30 minutes. Pick 30 minutes. I do it at the beginning of my day where my phone is just in another room. And it guarantees that I have unmediated space in my day to do devotionals, to pray, to just kind of start my day not on the agenda of the algorithm. So that's one thing I would say. I think for churches, I think it's important that pastors and church leaders start talking about media habits and scrolling habits as a discipleship issue. This is a spiritual formation crisis in our culture. And I think pastors kind of view it as like, oh, it's just a thing that the kids are doing, or it's just like a neutral thing, technology. But I think there's great spiritual consequences. And I think more churches need to lean into this and like actually talk to people in their churches about like, what are your scrolling habits? Like, do you have a 30-minute break in your day where you don't look at your phone? Questions like that.
Yeah. Speak to the idea that the church is an embodied church. It's real people in the real presence. In real places.
Yeah. I mean, that wouldn't have been an uncontroversial statement 20 years ago, but it's become kind of a thing we have to remind ourselves that the church is a physical gathering of people God created as embodied beings to be together. The pandemic didn't help, right? Because we all had to go virtual for a time. But I think now that we don't have to meet virtually, we need to remind people that the gathering in physical being is God's design for the church. I think this is going to be one of the most countercultural aspects of the church going forward in the digital age, as more and more life is lived virtually. People just kind of have their relationships virtually. They do their jobs on Zoom. They do their shopping. Less and less of life will be lived in an embodied way. But I think that's bad because that is subhuman. That's not the way we were created.
Yeah.
And so if the church can be an advocate, can celebrate embodied community, that's going to be a great life-giving thing. So that's what we're talking about in the subtitle of the book, Reclaiming Life in the Digital Age. A key way we can do that is by reclaiming embodied life as the church.